When I woke, the sea was the only thing still breathing beside me. The bed was cold on her side, not empty but hollow, the way a wound feels before the blood arrives. The window was open. Curtains fluttered against the dawn, carrying the scent of rain and something softer. Jasmine, maybe. Her perfume still deciding whether to leave with her. For a moment, I didn't understand. The mind protects itself before the heart can intervene. But then I saw it, the folded paper on the nightstand, weighed down by my cufflinks. My name written in her handwriting, small and deliberate, like she'd practiced the goodbye before she ever found the courage to write it. You taught me safety, but not freedom. So I'm learning it on my own. No signature. No plea. Just truth. Sharp, small, final. I sat there for a long time, watching the ink tremble in my hand. Outside, the storm from the night before had left the sky bruised and quiet. A gull cried once, high and lonely. The ocean stretched toward the horizon as if it had stolen her, and I had no right to ask for her back. She was gone. And for the first time, the silence in this house didn't sound like peace. It sounded like her absence rehearsing eternity. The hallway beyond the door was still dark. The staff wouldn't wake for another hour. I walked through the mansion barefoot, the floors cool beneath me, every room remembering her, the half-empty teacup on the table, the shawl she left draped over the chair, the faint indentation of her body on the couch where she used to read. The world hadn't ended. It had just rearranged itself without her. I stopped by the iron doors, open to the wind, the garden glistening with last night's rain. Drops clung to the roses like guilt. The gravel path beyond the gate disappeared into mist. No car tracks, no sign of struggle. Just quiet determination written in the way the world refused to stop her. I closed the doors slowly, the hinges groaning like an old man confessing regret. For the first time, the sound didn't mean safety. It meant loss. I wanted to hate her for leaving. But hate is a luxury for men who don't understand love. And I, God help me, had learned too well what love could cost a man like me. The mansion didn't speak. It just watched me, waiting to see what I'd do next. I lit a cigarette I didn't want and exhaled into the morning light. The smoke curled toward the window like it was following her. Somewhere between the sea and the city, she was learning how to breathe without my name attached. And I was left with the question I'd spent a lifetime avoiding. What does a man become when the only person who made him human decides to be free? The first morning without her tasted like ash and routine. The sun came late, filtered through clouds that hadn't yet decided whether to keep raining. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the steam curling from a cup of coffee I didn't remember making. It smelled like the one she used to prepare. Dark roast, 1 sugar, no cream, but it didn't taste the same. Maybe grief burns the tongue before the heat ever touches it. Her chair was still across from mine, a pale ghost in the sunlight. There were fingerprints on the table, a single strand of her hair near the edge. The smallest things always outlive the biggest promises. For a while, I kept telling myself she'd call. That her absence was just another one of her silences, the kind that used to stretch between us before she'd finally look at me and ask, "Do you ever wish you were someone else?" I never had an answer. I think she left because of that. Somewhere far from the mansion, in a city too loud to remember me, she was walking down a street that smelled like bread and rain. The collar of her coat was turned up. Her shoes were still too expensive for the sidewalks she was learning to trust. She stopped at a small bakery with fogged glass, pressed her palm against the window, and watched a man dust flour over dough with the same care I used to use when brushing her hair away from her face. Freedom didn't feel like flying. It felt like breathing someone else's air until you remembered it was yours. She found a small room above a florist's shop. The landlord didn't ask questions. The window faced a narrow alley, and the faint glow of a neon sign that flickered all night like a tired heartbeat. She bought secondhand clothes, folded them neatly into the drawers, and told herself that simplicity could heal what opulence had damaged. But at night, when the rain returned, it carried the same rhythm as the sea against the cliff, and she wondered if he could hear it too. I tried to fill the house with noise orders, meetings, the steady pulse of business. My men moved around me like nervous shadows, pretending not to notice how I watched the front gate, as if a car might appear at any moment. When they spoke of the city, of supply lines, of territories, of alliances, I caught myself listening for her name. She was the one thing I'd never planned for, the only secret I couldn't control. Once I walked into the conservatory. Her book was still there, open to a line underlined in pencil. You cannot own what was never yours to begin with. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd built an empire to keep the world from taking what I loved, only to realize that the walls I built were the very thing that pushed her away. In the city, she learned to smile at strangers again. The woman at the flower shop downstairs taught her which blooms meant goodbye and which meant forgiveness. The baker gave her leftover bread when it rained, too hard for customers to come in. Slowly, she began to exist without being watched. And yet, some nights, she'd wake in the dark, certain she'd heard footsteps at the door, a hand brushing the lock, a whisper calling her name. The fear passed quickly, but the ache stayed. It wasn't danger she missed. It was the sound of someone who knew how to quiet her storms by standing in them. One morning, I found her note again, the one she'd left by the bed. I'd read it 100 times, but this time, I noticed the way the ink had bled near the bottom. A raindrop, maybe, or a tear. It didn't matter. The message stayed the same. You taught me. Safety, but not freedom. I folded it and slipped it into my wallet. Behind the photograph of my mother, the only two women who'd ever taught me how love could hurt without meaning to. That night, I told my right-hand man to cancel every meeting. The city had gone quiet lately. Too quiet. And somewhere, I had the feeling that quiet was learning her name. It started with a name. Not hers, someone else's. But names have gravity, and that one carried a piece of her orbit. My second-in-command came into my office just after midnight, rain dripping from his coat. He hesitated in the doorway, which meant whatever he'd brought wasn't business. It was personal. "Boss," he said quietly. "One of our men saw someone near the old harbor district. Said she looked familiar." The room went still. I hadn't asked about her in weeks. That was the rule I'd made. Silence keeps the wound clean. But something in me broke protocol before my mind caught up. "Where?" "A bakery on Pier Street." "She was buying bread." "Alone?" "Yeah, looked different. Shorter hair. New clothes, but..." He stopped. It was her, wasn't it? He didn't answer, and he didn't need to. After he left, I sat for a long time with the city map spread across my desk. Pier Street was neutral ground. No family owned it. But everyone watched it. If she'd chosen that place, she hadn't chosen safety. She'd chosen distance. I poured myself a drink, the ice cracking like bone, and tried to believe I could let her stay gone. But love is an addiction. The heart relapses on quietly. In the city, she didn't know she'd been seen. The rain that morning was soft, almost forgiving. She walked to work with her coat pulled tight, her hair damp against her neck. The world had begun to feel ordinary again, enough to trick her into forgetting what kind of ghosts follow ordinary women. She served customers, smiled when she could, laughed when she forgot to be careful. When she wiped down the counter, she didn't notice the black car parked across the street, engine idling, lights off. The men inside weren't his. Different suits, different silence. One of them lit a cigarette and said, "She doesn't even know she's marked." By evening, I'd made my decision. I told myself it wasn't about love. It was about loose ends, reputation, unfinished things. But even lies can wear truth's clothing if you say them softly enough. I left the mansion after midnight. No guards. No entourage. Just the hum of the car and the sound of rain scraping against the windshield. The road down from the cliffs was slick. The city lights below blurred by fog. Every street looked smaller than I remembered. Every corner held the memory of someone I'd tried not to need. When I reached Pier Street, the bakery's sign was dark. The window still glowed faintly from a light inside. I watched from across the road, the engine silent. Through the glass, I could see her silhouette, cleaning tables, moving slowly, humming a song she used to hum when she thought I couldn't hear. Freedom looked good on her. It also looked fragile. I should have driven away. Instead, I watched until she turned off the lights and disappeared into the rain. The next morning, I got the call, a voice I didn't recognize. Low, calm, you shouldn't have let her go. Who is this? Doesn't matter. She's in the middle of a story you started. Then the line went dead. It took me less than an hour to trace the number. It led nowhere. Burner phone, dead end. But that wasn't the point. The point was the message. Someone else had found her. And this time, they weren't just watching. In her apartment, she found the first note that evening, slipped under the door, written in block letters, "You can't run from history, especially when it still bleeds." She froze. Her first instinct was to call the police, but she'd learned long ago that some threats don't speak that language. So she folded the note carefully, placed it in a drawer, and told herself it was nothing. But she left the lights on that night, and when thunder broke again, she closed her eyes and whispered a name she swore she'd stopped believing in. Back in the mansion, I stood before the iron doors. Rain streaking the glass. The sea below was wild again. The world had started to remind me of itself. I realized then, letting her go hadn't freed her. It had only freed the wolves. Freedom is quiet until you realize how loud your heart is. In the days that followed, she tried to keep her life small. Work, sleep, breathe, repeat. But quiet routines are just the way people pretend they're not waiting for something. She'd walk home along the same street every night, head down, hand on her bag, pretending not to notice the feeling that eyes were following her. Sometimes she'd stop and turn, but the street would be empty. Only the reflection of her own fear in the rain-soaked pavement. She told herself it was paranoia. But deep down, she knew the past doesn't stay buried just because you stop digging. Meanwhile, I'd forgotten how to rest. The bed felt like a stage for ghosts. I slept on the couch, the sound of the sea grinding itself against the cliff below, relentless, repetitive, faithful in its destruction. I told myself I wouldn't interfere, that she deserved her peace, her anonymity. But love has a cruel sense of humor. It turns protection into longing, and longing into obsession before you can tell the difference. Every night, I checked the security reports, no updates, no movement. But her image wouldn't leave me. The way she'd looked the night before she left, eyes like they were already somewhere else. I started writing letters I never sent. Little things. Do you still take sugar in your coffee? The roses bloomed early this year. I'm trying not to find you. Each one ended up in the fire before dawn. It didn't matter. The words had already burned through me first. She found herself doing the same thing in her own way. Writing his name on the back of receipts. Scribbling thoughts she'd never send. I'm learning how to walk without looking over my shoulder. The city feels smaller when I stop pretending you're not in it. Some nights, she'd sit by the window, looking out at the narrow alley. The rain would fall, rhythmic and patient, and she'd close her eyes, just to imagine the sound of his voice calling her name again. She hated herself for missing it. But absence doesn't erase love. It just teaches it how to whisper. In my world, patience is the mask you wear when you're planning to break it. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was grief disguised as discipline. I began training at dawn again. Old habits. The gym. The shooting range. The solitude. Each repetition another way to bleed the ache out of my muscles. Each breath another argument with the man I was before her. My men stopped asking questions. They saw the change in me. The quiet kind of danger, the one that doesn't shout before it strikes. But even they didn't understand that this time, the enemy wasn't outside. It was the version of me that couldn't stand the thought of letting her stay gone. In the city, she dreamed of the mansion sometimes, not the violence or the fear, but the moments between the smell of coffee in the morning, the way the light fell through the window onto his hands as he buttoned his shirt, the sound of the ocean, pretending to be calm. She woke up crying once, not from sadness, but from how real it had felt. And for the first time since leaving, she whispered to herself, maybe I should have said goodbye properly. I went back to the conservatory one night. The roses had wilted since she left, even though the gardener swore he'd kept them alive. Maybe flowers, like people, refuse to bloom for anyone who doesn't speak their language. I touched one of the petals and it crumbled between my fingers, and I thought, maybe that's what she's doing right now, somewhere out there, crumbling quietly, pretending it's growing. The thunder started again in the distance, and with it came a thought I didn't want but couldn't ignore. If I could feel the storm returning, maybe she could too. That night, 2 different hearts, one in a mansion by the sea, one in a city that never forgave, woke at the same hour, looked at the same rain, and whispered the same thing into the dark. I'm not done with you yet. The city was changing again, not in the way ordinary people notice. New billboards, new lights, but in the subtle shifts only men like me feel. Too many eyes. Where there should be shadows, too much quiet. Where there should be noise. Something was moving under the surface, and it was moving toward her. She didn't see it right away. The days had begun to blur again, the kind of repetition that feels safe because it hides you from thinking. She woke, worked, returned home. She learned to smile again, though the smile never reached her eyes. Then one evening, she found her front door unlocked. It was small, barely a click. A shift in the latch. She told herself she'd forgotten, but when she stepped inside, the air felt different. The mirror on the wall had a fingerprint that wasn't hers, and on the table, a single rose, blackened at the edges, water dripping from the stem, no note this time. Just the scent of warning. She threw it away, locked the door again, and tried to convince herself that ghosts don't use flowers. But that night she didn't sleep. At the mansion, I woke to headlights crawling across the driveway. One of my men, Nico, came in drenched, the kind of wet that comes from running through more than rain. "Boss," he said, breathing hard. We intercepted chatter. Valenti crew's back in the city, and they've been asking questions. What kind of questions? About her. The words landed like a gunshot I couldn't see. It wasn't surprise that hit me. It was confirmation. The silence I'd felt for weeks wasn't peace. It was a pause before the storm. Who talked? I asked. No one from inside. They're using new routes, new faces. They think she's leverage. Leverage. The word made my stomach turn. They didn't want her. They wanted me, and they'd come through the one place I was weak enough to bleed. That night, I drove back into the city. No convoy. No noise, just a single car and a mind already sharpening itself on guilt. The streets were slick, empty, humming with neon and distance. When I reached her building, the lights were still on. I stood across the street for a long time, watching the silhouette behind the curtain. Her pacing, her uncertainty, the way she'd occasionally press her hand to her mouth, as if trying not to speak my name. Sound broke the stillness. A motorcycle engine cutting through the alley behind her building. 2 figures. One waiting near the fire escape. I didn't think. I moved. Upstairs. She heard the noise too, metallic, sharp. The sound of something scraping against the fire escape ladder. Her body reacted before her mind did. Lights off. Heart racing, phone in hand. She stood in the dark, listening to her own breath and the faint creak of metal outside the window. Then, a knock. Soft, slow, intentional. She froze. Who's there? Silence. Another knock. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She took a step back toward the door, and that's when the window shattered. A hand reached in, grabbing the latch, pulling hard. She screamed. The phone slipped from her hand, and then gunfire. 2 quick bursts. The hand disappeared. The night erupted in motion. She dropped to the floor, shaking, covering her ears as the sounds outside tore through the rain. Footsteps. A door kicked open. Then, "It's me." His voice. Rough, familiar, commanding. She looked up through the dark, eyes wide, the silhouette in the doorway, soaked, breathing hard, a gun in one hand, the other outstretched toward her. "You're hurt?" he asked. "No." Then get up. We're leaving." Outside, the alley was chaos. 2 men down. A third running. He didn't bother chasing him. There would be time for vengeance later. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered. He opened the car door for her like it was the most normal thing in the world, even though both of them were trembling. She hesitated, looked at him, at the gun, at the rain sliding down his face. "You found me," she said softly. He met her eyes, voice low, unreadable. "No, you were never lost." They drove in silence. City lights blurred into streaks of gold and shadow. She stared out the window, hands clenched in her lap. "You said you'd let me go?" "I did." "Then why are you here?" "Because someone else didn't." The words hung between them. Not an excuse. Not a promise, just the truth. When they reached the cliffs, the mansion appeared through the fog like a memory refusing to die. He led her inside. The doors still scarred from the last time they'd closed behind her. And for the first time since she left, she realized that sometimes freedom isn't about distance. It's about who shows up when the danger does. The storm didn't stop when they reached the mansion. It simply decided to live inside instead of outside. He led her through the grand hall, dripping rain on marble floors, the chandelier flickering like it remembered fear. Neither spoke. The sound of their footsteps filled the silence that used to hold laughter. When he finally turned, his eyes looked older, like he'd lived a lifetime in the weeks she'd been gone. "Sit," he said quietly. She did, if only because her legs didn't trust her anymore. He set the gun on the table between them. Rainwater slid off the barrel, forming a thin line of silver that cut across the wood like punctuation. "They were Valenti's men," he said. "I thought you left them behind." "I thought I left a lot of things behind." He poured a drink, didn't taste it. They wanted leverage. "You." Her throat tightened. "So, I really never escaped." He shook his head slowly. "You did. You escaped me. They were just a reminder that the world doesn't forgive men like me, or the women who try to love them." She stared at him. "I never wanted forgiveness." He looked up. For a moment the mask cracked. "Then what did you want?" "To be seen." The words landed between them like something sacred. He blinked, once, slow, as if he'd been struck somewhere language couldn't reach. "You were," he whispered. "Too much. That's why I locked the doors. Because I knew what the world would do if it saw you the way I did." She rose from her chair. "You didn't lock me away for safety. You locked me away because you couldn't stand the thought that someone else might love me too." The chandelier flickered again. Outside, thunder rolled its judgment. He stood, meeting her eyes, voice low and stripped of defense. "You're right. The honesty hit harder than any denial could have." He took a step closer. "When you left, I told myself I was doing the right thing, that you needed freedom. But the truth is, I let you go because I couldn't stand what I was turning into while you watched me." She wanted to hate him. She wanted to scream. But instead, she saw it. The exhaustion in his face. The way his hands shook when he tried to light another cigarette and failed. He wasn't a monster anymore. Just a man who'd run out of ways to make love look gentle. The thunder moved farther out to sea. Silence fell heavy, the kind that doesn't demand an answer. She walked to the window. The glass was cold against her fingertips. "When I was gone, she said softly. I kept hearing your voice every time it rained. Like the world was trying to remind me that safety doesn't sound like peace. It sounds like you. He closed the distance slowly, careful not to touch her until she turned. When she did, he was already there, close enough for the warmth of his breath to undo weeks of distance. Then why did you run? He asked. Because I wanted to know if I'd still choose you, even when I didn't have to. She looked up at him. The lightning painted them in white and gold. And, her voice trembled, I still do, he exhaled. The kind of sound that belongs to men who've been holding their breath for too long. For the first time in months, he touched her, not to claim, not to cage, but to confirm she was real. His hand found her cheek, rough against soft, and the storm finally let go. Then stay, he said. I don't want to stay locked up. Then don't. Stay, as long as you want to leave. Outside, the rain eased into drizzle. Inside, the chandelier steadied its light, and for the first time, the mansion didn't feel like a cage. It felt like an apology. Morning came slowly, as if even the sun was afraid to wake them. The rain had stopped. The world outside the mansion looked washed clean, but inside, everything was still raw, the kind of silence that follows confession. She stood at the balcony, wrapped in one of his shirts, watching the ocean pull itself apart against the rocks. The waves had his rhythm, relentless, unwilling to let go. Behind her, he poured 2 cups of coffee, the gesture simple, almost human. You're thinking about leaving again, he said. She didn't deny it. I don't belong in this world of yours. Then help me change it. She turned, frowning softly. You can't change what you built. Maybe not, he said, but I can stop building more of it. He sat across from her, hands folded, eyes steady. They'll come again, he said quietly. Valenti's not the kind of man who loses and forgets. Then we end it. We? You think you're the only one who's tired of running? Her tone wasn't defiant. It was final. A declaration, not a plea. He stared at her for a long moment, something like pride flickering beneath the fatigue. You're different, he said. So are you, she replied. You just stopped noticing. For the first time, they planned together. He showed her the maps, the routes, the names that once meant fear. She asked questions he didn't expect her to ask. Sharp, insightful, unflinching. He'd spent a lifetime surrounded by people who followed him. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be challenged by someone who loved him. When night fell, she practiced firing a gun in the garden. He stood beside her, adjusting her grip, steadying her hands. The shot rang through the air, echoing off the cliffs. She lowered the weapon. Heart racing, I hate it, she whispered. Good, he said. That's how I know you'll never use it unless you have to. They both smiled. Small, fragile, but real. Over the next days, the mansion became something else. Not a prison. Not a fortress. A command center built from guilt and redemption. He reached out to allies who owed him favors, not debts. She worked quietly beside him, sorting papers, making calls, learning the edges of the empire he'd once ruled like a god. Every night, they'd end up in the library, sharing silence that no longer hurt. She noticed his temper fade, the sharpness soften. He noticed her fear dissolve, replaced by a calm strength that made him wonder who was protecting who. One evening, they found themselves outside again, near the garden that had once been her sanctuary. The roses had returned, new blooms, pale and alive. He leaned against the railing, cigarette in hand, watching the horizon fade from gold to blue. When I built this house, he said, I wanted it to be a place the world couldn't touch, and turns out the world lives in the people you care about. You can't build walls high enough to keep them out, she smiled faintly. So what now? Now, he said, we take back what's ours. Not the power, not the money. The peace we traded for it. He turned to her then, eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. You shouldn't have to fight my battles. I'm not fighting yours, she said. I'm fighting ours. That night, they drove together for the first time since she left. Down the coastal road, past the fog and salt, into the city that had once swallowed them both. No guards. No fear. Just two people finally walking into the world on their own terms. When they reached the old district, she looked at him. You know this could end badly. Everything worth saving usually does. And as the city lights reflected in the windshield, they both understood something they never had before. Love wasn't about keeping each other safe, and it was about standing together when safety was no longer an option. The city always looks different after a storm. It forgets the violence quicker than people do. Rain washes the blood from the pavement, but not from the memory. By the time the sun rose over the harbor, the Valentis were finished, not by gunfire, that would have been too merciful, but by silence. Their deals vanished. Their allies disappeared. Their name, once loud enough to terrify, now whispered itself out of existence. He'd done it without killing a man. For the first time in his life, he'd won a war by refusing to start one. She stood beside him in the warehouse where it all ended, papers signed, signatures sealing decades of rivalry into history. He didn't look victorious. He looked free. It's over, she said quietly. For them, he replied. Not for me, she frowned. What do you mean? Power doesn't end when you walk away from it. It ends when you stop letting it define you. He took a lighter from his pocket. Gold, engraved, a gift from his father, and set the corner of the contract ablaze. The flames crawled up the page, eating the ink, swallowing the names that had once meant everything. When it was done, he dropped the lighter into the fire and watched it melt. That was your father's, she whispered. So was the curse, he said. I'm done carrying both. They drove back to the coast in silence, the kind that feels like healing instead of distance. The ocean waited for them, still, endless, patient. When the mansion came into view, it looked different. The gates were open. The doors stood wide, letting the breeze carry the salt inside. The smell of roses drifted from the garden, alive again. He parked the car and didn't move for a moment. I don't know what comes next, he admitted. Then let's find out, she said softly. Inside, she wandered through the house like a woman meeting an old friend who'd learned to be gentle. The rooms that once echoed with fear now felt lighter. The walls no longer listened for. Footsteps. Even the light seemed softer, golden, forgiving. She paused by the library window, looking out at the sea. You're really leaving all of it behind? She asked. All of it, he said. Even the mansion? He smiled faintly. No, the house stays. But it's yours now if you want it. Mine? You're the only thing that ever made it feel like home. Her eyes softened. And you? I'll stay until you tell me to go. That night, they didn't speak much. They sat on the terrace side by side, watching the horizon swallow the sun. He poured wine into 2 glasses, the liquid catching the last light of day. She rested her head on his shoulder, and for once, neither of them was pretending to be strong. The world had stopped chasing them. They had stopped running. Do you still think I should have stayed away? She asked. He shook his head. No. You leaving was the only reason I could find my way back. The wind carried the faint sound of waves against the cliff, the same rhythm as the night he'd first locked the doors, only now they were open, and the sound no longer felt like warning. It felt like peace. Later, as the stars came out, she turned to him. If I leave again someday, then I'll open the door myself, he said. She smiled. You think I'll need permission? No, he said softly. But I'll still want to be the one who watches you walk into your freedom. He brushed his thumb across her cheek, the way a man touches something he knows he can't own. You were never mine, he whispered. But you were always the reason I wanted to be better. She leaned in, her lips just a breath away. Then you already are. And somewhere outside, the sea broke against the rocks one last time. Not in anger, but in applause. It's strange, the way silence can learn to sound like peace. Months passed. Seasons changed quietly over the cliffs. Roses bloomed, storms came and went, and the sea kept its endless rhythm like a promise it never meant to break. He no longer ruled anything. No empire, no men, just the small corner of the world where love had finally outlasted power. She still worked in the city sometimes, volunteering at the flower shop, teaching others how to tend to fragile things without breaking them. He'd drive her there in the mornings, wait in the car with the radio off, content just to watch her walk away. Not because he owned her, but because he could let her go. Some evenings, they'd sit together on the terrace as the sun folded itself into the ocean. No guards, no shadows, just the sound of their glasses clinking quietly against the wind. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked one night. "What? The danger. The power. Sometimes," he admitted. "But it doesn't miss me," she smiled, turning her face toward the horizon. "Then maybe that's what freedom really is. When the past finally stops looking for you." He looked at her for a long time, the woman who once walked away so she could return. "Whole and love?" he asked softly. "Love," she said, "is when you stop mistaking protection for possession." The sea wind carried her words out into the dark. He reached for her hand, fingers brushing hers, and the world seemed to hold its breath, not because of what might happen next, but because of what no longer needed to. In the distance, thunder rolled faintly across the water, not a warning anymore, just memory stretching its limbs. She closed her eyes and leaned against him. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost like prayer. "Sometimes," he whispered, "I still wake up afraid you'll be gone again. And if I am, then I'll still be here." Door open. When dawn came, it painted the walls gold. Light fell through the open doors, touching everything that had once been hidden. The mansion didn't look like his anymore, or hers. It looked like forgiveness given form. She stood at the threshold, hand resting on the iron door she once escaped through. The ocean roared below, gentle now. She turned to him and smiled. "I never really left, did I?" "No," he said quietly. "You just took the long way home, and that's the truth of it. Some loves don't end, they just evolve. They teach us that freedom isn't found by running, and safety isn't built by walls. Sometimes love grows strongest not in possession, but in permission, in the courage to open the door and trust that the right heart will walk back through it. So if you ever find yourself holding on too tightly, remember this. Sometimes letting go isn't losing. It's the beginning of keeping someone right. Fade out. Rain softens to silence. The chandelier flickers once, then steadies, golden and still.